I'm going to hand things off to Noam and Boris from the team at Sweet Security. Welcome. Super excited to have you all here. And please, by all means, take it away. I think you guys are planning on sharing slides from
Yeah.
your side of things, right?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you,
Have
Dave.
fun.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. We're Sweet Security here. We're going to be talking about Kubernetes risks, how they emerge at runtime, and we'll show some actual lessons from our attack scenarios. To kick things off, so it's really great to be here. My name is Noam. I'm a product manager here at Sweet.
And I'm Boris. I'm with the Solution Architects team.
Perfect. So before we talk about tools and vendors and all of that fun, I actually want to start with talking about Kubernetes itself. And Kubernetes environments, as you probably know, aren't insecure because teams are careless, right? We're not necessarily putting the blame there. Kubernetes environments are more hard to secure or insecure because of Kubernetes' nature. So Kubernetes, as you know, it's dynamic, it's distributed, it's permission driven, and pods are ephemeral. Services are constantly being scaled up and down. Identities are being reused. And also, once something is allowed, Kubernetes will assume it's intentional. And those are all really good things. They're pluses of Kubernetes. They give tons of flexibility. They give scalability. And this is all great right up until something in the behavior actually starts to change.
Yeah, and when we kind of look at it in the context of real-world environments, production deployments, and so on, so for example, with an on-prem Kubernetes clusters, it's very common that we will have either a very limited set of logs to look through or even no logs at all. And in most cases, also the clusters themselves don't really expose the control plane outside. So basically, as soon as something goes wrong, we're often left reconstructing the events after the fact and kind of gives us a very fragmented view instead of looking at the overall behavior. So by the time that we do get and have and gather enough context, the incident is typically already over, and it's quite difficult to understand what happened to begin with the ephemeral workload.
Yeah, so the classic Kubernetes looks secure until it isn't. I think most Kubernetes incidents, they don't really start with obvious failures. So if you look at the stats, if you look at everything on paper, normally RBAC is configured well and the network policies are perfectly enforced. All the images are scanned. The compliance dashboards are completely green, nothing to worry about. And basically, these environments really look exactly like what all of us are aiming to have in production.
Yeah, and when teams do investigate afterwards, typically the conclusions that they get to remain the same. Again, no exposed components in the control plane. As far as misconfiguration go, there aren't any glaring issues. And as a whole, there really isn't even a single control that's been broken. Realistically speaking, the security model itself didn't fail, but it just didn't see the problem early enough to begin with.
Yeah. So this is where the tools part starts, and this is really where CNAPP actually comes in. And CNAPP gives us a really great unified view of all of the different risks in the Kubernetes environment and across the cloud in a broader sense. So it shows things like configuration posture, it shows identities, and it shows access. It gives a full view of all the different vulnerabilities and all the exposure.
Yeah, and this visibility is critical because it tells us what should be the truth, right? Which permissions exist, which services are exposed, and which images we use that pose a certain level of risk.
Yeah, that's true. And I think something to note is that CNAPP really mostly describes the configurations and the intent. So what was configured and what was approved. And as we mentioned, Kubernetes really rarely breaks at the configuration time. It normally breaks after that when you're after the deployment and suddenly a service starts behaving not as intended and starts doing things it never did before.
Yeah, and then this is because individually, each action in separate manner is allowed and looks fine and legit. But when we start glue them and look at everything together, and obviously over time, they do actually begin to tell us and show us different picture. And this is exactly where the runtime component aligns with the CNAPP because it really comes into play and takes all those configurations and intents, and then adds the runtime visibility literally on top of that and show us not only what was configured, but also where the risks were in practice and connect it to most specifically relevant Kubernetes risks as a whole.
Yeah. So enough with the intros, I think, and we'll actually start with the demo. So I'm going to head over to the Suite platform. So let's go there. And yeah, so let's jump straight into it. What you're seeing here is our incidents page, and I'm actually going to look at an incident that's unified. And this means that it's an incident that correlates findings both from the cloud logs, but also actual runtime activity that we detect with our eBPF sensor. So let's take this incident, for example. And at a high level, just to understand what this incident is about, and by the way, we can already see this really easily just from the title, but this is essentially an incident about finding sensitive data, exfiltrating it, and then trying to clear the tracks. And in a bit more details, we'll look at the story. And really what you can see here is a story of an attacker that started off with reconnaissance. They started off by listing all the different S3 buckets, identifying what are their potential targets. And in the second step, we see that they found something. So they found a bucket with a name that actually suggests that it does contain sensitive data. And after that, we can see that they successfully, in their target bucket, they successfully found credit card information. And what we also see is that they used the DNS query externally to pastebin in order to exfiltrate that information. So at this point, the information is already kind of leaving the premise here. Now, after that, we're also seeing all the different attempts to clear the track. So it starts with the instance metadata, getting the credentials from there, and after that, trying to disable the logs and delete some of the logs. So just so it doesn't seem like anything was done, right? Everything is left as it is, but the data is already out. And it's really important to note here that when an application deletes CloudTrail or VPC flow logs, that's something that's done with intent. That's not something that an application does by accident. So at this point, we already know that something happened. And now let's actually get into the details and see what happened and investigate it. So I'm going to scroll down to the graph view here of the incident. And immediately off the bat, I can see all of the different components of the incident. So I can see that there were multiple pods involved, and I can see that there were multiple targets that were attacked. And then I can also see all of the different processes by the pods in this incident. Now, I'll probably want to respond to this incident in some way and maybe terminate some of the suspicious or problematic processes. But before I do that, I think it's important to get an understanding of the entire environment that I'm in. So in order to do that, I'll go into one of the pods, and actually I want to start at a higher level. So I'll see exactly where this pod is, and I can see all the hierarchy above it, and I'm going to go into the cluster where this pod is. Now I have all the information on the cluster, but where I'm going to start is in the topology view. So the topology view, really the idea here is to give me all of the different microservices, show them all the microservices in the environment, as well as the connections between them. So I'll click into the cluster, and I can see all the different components. I can keep diving in here, but I think at this point, what we'll see here is that there are some internal connections within the components of the cluster, which is expected. But then around that, we also see that we have some connections from the cluster to some of the cloud provider services like IMDS. And we're also seeing some external connections, which might maybe look a bit suspicious to me. Now, beyond the topology, I can go and see all the connections in the environment, and I can do that through the connections view. So the connections view really surfaces all of the different connections across layer 4 and layer 7. And I can go ahead and filter for the relevant cluster that we were looking at. So let's do that. And what I'm seeing here is all the different information of the specific, of all the connections, such as the port and protocol, and I can dive into these connections. But actually, if I relate this back to the incident that we're looking at, since we already know which pod we're suspecting here because we have that surfaced in the incident, I think what would be best here is to look at the pod itself and find the details from there. And what we have here in the platform is all the information and all the different insights that we have across the entire platform, all centered here with the context of the specific pod. So first of all, I have just an overview of what is this pod and a quick risk analysis so I can immediately look at this and understand if there are any risks that I need to be aware of. I also have the full details of the manifest, and then I can see all the different insights that Suite has to give. So if there are any other incidents, I can see that here. I can look at the specific findings before they were correlated into incidents. I can see the vulnerabilities. And then I have the connections tab, which is where I was heading to. And in the connections tab, same view like we saw before in the main page, but now everything is in the focus of the specific pod. Now, I have all the connections here, and if anything here looks suspicious to me, I can click onto that connection, and this gives me all the extra internal details. So we're not only seeing the source and the destination, we're actually seeing the sampled connection instances. We're seeing how they're split over time, and we have all the details. So we have the exact source and destination IP, and as I mentioned, we correlate here connections from layer 4 and layer 7. So if it's a layer 7 connection, we'll also see the destination endpoint. And this really gives me all the details that I need to go back with full confidence and a full understanding of what happened in this incident, take the relevant process that I want to act on, and even terminate that process. And at that point, we're good. The incident is resolved. But I think one more thing, and this is like a natural question that normally comes up after this, is how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again, right? What prevents an attacker from doing the exact same thing tomorrow and exfiltrating different data? So we're going to go back to the pod in the incident, actually. And if I scroll down to the metadata, what I can see here is that I have the information among a lot of other information, but I have the information on the image that this pod was created from. And actually that image is the source of what introduced the behavior into the cluster. So instead of kind of waiting, sitting patiently and waiting for this to happen again at runtime, we can stop it earlier. And the way that we're going to do this is with our admission controller. Now, with the admission controller, it's really simple. All I need to do is click on add the policy. And I start out by giving the details of the policy, so the name and the description, and I can assign it to a specific category. After that, I can choose if I want it to be related only to the specific cluster or to all clusters. And this is where the fun part is. I don't really need to know how to write the policy or give all the details. I can just write it in plain English and Suite will do the hard work for me. So I have this example prepared here for this specific incident. So in this case, again, I'm interested in blocking any pod that's created from this repo. And then once I click on convert to Rego, Suite is going to generate me the policy definition. I can review that. I can save the policy. And from that point on, any attempt that we see to spin up a pod from under this repo will automatically be denied at creation time. So we're not waiting for this to happen again at runtime.
All right. Thank you, Noam. So let's look at another incident, but actually from a different point of view, from a different layer to be more precise. So this one primarily is not, we'll not talk about the infrastructure or the network as Noam showed us, but actually it will show us what happens once traffic from the internet reaches into one of our applications. So I'll go and filter by the application label and look at one of my ADR incidents. So, and do keep in mind that what we're seeing here is really a series of web application attacks against a certain Node.js app that I have running inside my cluster. This is not like a single alert. It's really correlation of many findings into an incident that built upon and throughout the time. So at a very high level, it's typical we begin with in order to understand the progression and what happened. So we see a SQL injection attempt that began with. Then we see some LFI and server-side request forgery probes and so on until eventually a certain successful command managed to exfiltrate some sort of sensitive data, in our case from this etc shadow. And this sequence really matters because it shows how an attacker interacts with the same service repeatedly while testing different techniques and approaches and adjusting his overall campaign against us based on the response that he gets. So from here, what I'll do is I'll go here and look at the investigation view. And this really gives us all the findings built in a timeline that makes up the incident in a very understandable way, time after time with timestamp to see what happened. So instead of us trying to guess, we can actually exactly see what techniques were observed as well as how often. So I'll actually take it one more step and look at the table view. And here, this pattern really, really starts to scream and become very obvious because we see the injections and the LFIs and so on, because we see that we have this sort of multiple attempts to hitting the same endpoint with different payloads against the same service. So at this point, this doesn't really look, like noise that comes from the internet, but more like a systematic probing that happens. So if we'll drill into one of these, like this patch traversal one, we can actually look at the overall payload in the layer 7 in the attack attempt. And here is where we kind of see the actual request came through that trigger it, the headers and the destination, the endpoint, the payload itself, as well as what response came through and what kind of data was, in this case, exfiltrated outside. So we really can see the entire layer 7 context, full request, full response, headers, body, and parameters. So this layer 7 visibility is not that just an attack was detected, right? But actually how the application itself handled this in runtime. And this is really what we mean when we say application detection and response. And while we're kind of observing how the applications are being used and, well, abused in this case, in real time, rather than relying on static definition or signatures, we can actually zoom a bit up and instead look at the API catalog to begin with. And this is really where we can see our runtime layer 7 catalog with all the endpoints and start categorizing them and see which endpoints are internal, which endpoints are internet facing and receive traffic from the internet, which endpoints talk to data services that might handle sensitive information, and so on. And this really helps us to answer a slightly different question, which is not, hey, was there an attack, right? But actually what the application is actually exposing towards the outside, as well as how these things are being interacted with. So if we'll take this and connect it to the incident Noam just showed us, I think that the pattern that we're starting to see here really remains the same, right? Because risk is not showing up due to something that we had misconfigured. It's actually showing up because the behavior at runtime no longer aligns and matches our initial expectation when we kind of deployed the application to begin with. Another important angle is the overall vulnerabilities, right? And I think that when we talk about application security, vulnerabilities are an inherent part of that. And I mean, these days, most tools will tell us which vulnerabilities exist in an image or in a package and so on. But what the runtime context adds here is the visibility into which of these vulnerabilities are actually loaded as well as executed on the workload or on the application in production. So when we take this and combine with everything else that we already know, right, because how the application behaves, what it connects to, what kind of places it has access to, and so on, this can really help us to reevaluate the risk. And instead of relying on something like a static severity score that comes from different location and places, we can actually apply this runtime context to help us prioritize how the vulnerability is actually impacting every single workload separately. So this really helps with understanding the truly criticality of which of the vulnerabilities that we have in the application, help us to kind of bubble up and focus on the ones that matter. And at the whole, this only and always based on how the application behaves.
Yeah. So yeah, those are two, I think, different use cases and different incidents. And in one case, the first one, we were looking at unexpected infrastructure behavior. And in the second one that Boris just showed, we were looking at unexpected application behavior. But I think if we kind of, like, these are different teams. If we stop to think about it, it's really the same idea that keeps repeating itself. We're seeing that again and again in incidents that are showing up in Kubernetes environments. Now, after we've looked at both of these, I feel like there's one more angle that we really have to mention, and especially because that's kind of top of mind for everyone these days, and that's AI, and that's workloads that actually act as AI agents. And with AI-based workloads, the game kind of changes, right? And runtime visibility becomes even more important for that. So with AI workloads, they're really unique in the sense that they don't just respond to requests, or they don't necessarily act as written and as prescribed. They actually act as agents, as their name entitles, and they make their decisions on their own sometimes, and they're able to call different APIs and use different tools or access different data. And they're able to move data on their own. So they kind of have this whole layer that classic, let's say, workloads don't really have. And from a security perspective, this is a really big shift, even though we're talking about the same components, and it's a really big risk that we need to take into account. So I'm going to switch over to our AI catalog to talk a bit about how we tackle this here. And what you're seeing is a view of all the different AI-driven workloads and components that we've detected in an environment. And we can drill into all the details on not just the agents, but also the models that empower these agents and how they're being used. Or we could talk about the MCP servers and the tools that are being exposed and how those are being used. Or we can look at the different packages or images that might be related to AI and how are those present in the environment. But I am going to focus mainly on the agents and the workloads, because as you know, these are the same workloads at the end of the day, the same Kubernetes built workloads, just with different purpose. Now, I'll go into one of the workloads, for example. And what you can see here immediately is an AI layer that helps me understand not just the details and the risks, the classic risks, let's say, of the workload, but the actual purpose and intent and meaning of the agent. So I can look at everything from an AI perspective, and I can see, okay, first of all, what is the agent? But then what triggers it? What makes it start acting? Or who is the owner of that if I need to contact that person? I can then see also which tools does the agent expose, or which tools does it actually invoke, even more than that. What knowledge does it have access to? So which data sources can it access and with which permissions? And I can also see here at the bottom the prompt sample. So this is the actual system prompt that's being used time and time again whenever the agent does pretty much anything. And this really helps me understand behaviorally, what is this workload supposed to do? Now, with all of that, I also do still have all of the different insights that Suite provides for all the workloads. And we can see here that there are some incidents for this agent. And I'll go into this incident, and I'm not going to go into the details of a third incident. Just in a very, very high level, we're looking at prompt injection attempts. These actually failed, hence the lower severity. But pretty much this is what it is. But the point that I'm trying to make is not about the specific attack technique. It's not about the actual details and what the agent did or what the attacker did. What I'm trying to say is that this is the same runtime model that we're seeing again and again, and it also applies here. And it doesn't matter whether it's infrastructure code, if it's a web application, or if in this case it's an AI agent, we're still looking at the same thing. And behavior at runtime that no longer makes sense for what the workload was intended to do originally. And that's really where the risk is starting to show up.
All right, that's great. Let's go back to the slide. And let's maybe zoom out a bit, and let's maybe start closing this with a very practical question. So given everything that we talked about so far, right, about drifts and runtime behavior, real-world attacks, AI, and so on, what should you actually do maybe differently within your Kubernetes cluster that you might have loaded and running these days? So I'll start with I guess the most obvious one is apply resource limits, right? And start checking what they are. Typically, when a workload is compromised, having a limited CPU or memory gives attackers room to explore, scan, and persist. And while this will not prevent the issue to begin with, it will significantly limit the potential damage. Next is use network segmentation and choose whatever CNAPP plugin works for you, honestly. Make sure just to be very intentional with your service-to-service communication that you're allowing, because in most cases, internal port traffic is widely open by default and makes lateral movements to be something very easy as well as very invisible, unless we're actually looking at something in real time. RBAC, right? We kind of mentioned that. Use an admission controller to ensure that the pods only run with the service accounts of permissions and restrictions that they need. This will help us to also enforce this idea of least privilege. And over time, permissions accumulate. So when workloads start to drift and change or even compromise, this really helps to address some of the inherent risk. And the fourth one is, well, images, right? Apply image hygiene, deploy only the images that you trust from your sources, and conduct continuous scans. Supply chain issues still is and are one of the most common entry points into organizations, Kubernetes specifically. And again, while these controls don't stop all the attacks, they will dramatically reduce how far an attacker can go to once they're inside, or even reduce the initial breach. And the second set of actions that we have will focus on visibility, identity, and ongoing maintenance. So secrets, right? Kubernetes secrets are great and convenient, but they're not encrypted unless base 64. And they were never designed to, hold sensitive information. So if you have encryption keys, API keys, certificates, and so on, anything valuable, use an external key management service, either that you get from your cloud provider or a third-party one. Apply and audit and monitor your API usage because most serious attacks for Kubernetes do involve API at some point. And seeing this unexpected or even unusual API calls that are being sent is often one of the very earliest indication that something's starting to go very, very wrong. Harden and patch, right? Patch regularly and make sure your control plane components are hardened where possible. Many attacks rely on exploiting known issues that were already fixed in the past, but the patch was never actually deployed and got to the right place. And lastly, we don't want anything to snoop in, so do apply encryption and use TLS certificates in your workload-to-workload communication, so the data is protected as well as cryptographically identified which kind of services talk to each other on every side of the connection, so we don't have any eavesdrops in that sense.
Yeah, so these are all really important takeaways. I do want to surface one more thing before we close, and that's back on the CNAPP side. What you saw today, everything you saw in the platform and everything we talk about really only works if it's useful to different teams at different moments. And the idea is that, for example, you have the security teams and they're using the view to understand the impact, right? They see the incident and they can immediately understand which workloads were involved, what data might be at risk, and how serious the incident actually is. On top of that, you have the platform and the DevOps teams, and they use the same content to understand the scope maybe. So where is it running and what else is connecting to it, whether the workload is isolated or not, or any additional information they need to understand the impact on their level. And then at the end of all of this, you have the developers, and they usually come in with more focused and more concrete questions like, what did my service actually do wrong in production, and tell me what I need to change, like what's the bottom line. And the important part here is that none of them are starting from scratch, right? They're all building on the same incident, using the same information and the same runtime behavior that helps them understand where the problem is, and they use the same underlying context. And for this, you have the CNAPP that really provides the static layer, so all the configurations and identity and exposure. To that, we add the really important runtime layer that actually gives the behavioral part. So what is actually running, what are the actual connections, what may be changed. And together, all of this shared context is really what lets the teams make more quick and informed decisions on how to act on incidents and threats and risks that they see. And I think that's really the confidence that you get with a runtime CNAPP in your Kubernetes environments. Yeah, sweet. Yeah. So that's all from us. Happy to take questions if we have time left.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.